Hello, I am Tom Gerard, and I will be going over the monitor hypothesis of second language acquisition. To begin, whoops, there we go. To begin, the founder of this theory is Dr. Stephen Krashen. He was a professor emeritus at the University of Southern California. He had specialized in the study of second language acquisition, and he had first proposed monitor hypothesis as part of his input hypothesis, which is 5 other theories that he believed were best used for second language acquisition, all the way back in 1982. So as for the historical context, Krashen started working on his theory throughout the 70s and 80s. This was during a time when a lot of work was being done on ideas about second language hypothesis, or not second language hypothesis, second language acquisition, ideas about how people develop, and a lot of behaviorist theories kind of not necessarily being thrown out, more so rejected. His monitor hypothesis was part of 5 second language hypotheses that he believed could explain language acquisition, the other 4 being input, acquisition learning, natural order, affective filter hypothesis. Of course, those of us from the other groups might know that most of these were not originally proposed by Krashen himself. You can see the short explanations of them written right over here on this part, but let us go forward with monitor hypothesis. Or sorry, some of the other people who worked on them. I'm getting ahead of myself. So his monitor hypothesis was in response to behaviorist theories that had existed long before. The main idea behind behaviorist theory is this idea that people pick up languages based only really off of imitating what they hear through either maybe things that they take in, the words of their parents, the words of the people around them. It's essentially like behaviorist theory proposes that the best way to learn a new language would be through complete and total like dumping the person into it, and that's how we pick it up. Of course, as the decades went on, he was influenced by several other linguists in the field, such as Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is known very much so in linguistic circles for like innatist theory, and really kind of being one of the first linguists to really kind of go against this idea of this behaviorist theory of language acquisition, which is going to influence Krashen's ideas himself. Piaget also brings forth his constructivist theory, and this is really the foundation through which Krashen's views are built upon. And of course, Stephen Krashen himself is the originator of this monitor hypothesis. So what is the monitor hypothesis itself? The monitor hypothesis is, unlike a lot of the other language hypotheses, this one is very specifically to how we use our second language. The idea behind it is that when you are learning a language, there is a whole bunch of tools that we get as we start to learn. These are things like the actual vocabulary words that we learn, things like grammar rules, tense rules, well that would fall under grammar, and all of these kind of rules that we think about when we speak. So if somebody is in a situation where they're going to have the speech, like in the illustration on the side, which is in a native English speaker being forced to speak in a Spanish class, there's a whole bunch of questions we ask or we might not ask ourselves. He calls this the conscious correction process. So if somebody were to ask you, like, can you say this sentence, there's going to be a whole like bunch of things that you ask yourself, like, oh, am I speaking in the right tense? Am I using the right words for this? Am I grammatically correct? And he proposes that different people have different levels through which they actually end up using this, which we'll go into a little bit later. So in order to effectively use the monitor, of course, we need to have some base level understanding of the languages. Really, some of the core 3 parts is that, 1, you have to know the rule in order to kind of correct yourself. If you don't know the rule, you don't really know what you're correcting. You need to be focused on actually speaking correctly. And you should have time to use the monitor. which is like this idea of if we do or don't. So like, for example, if I have a Spanish teacher who's going around the class asking for answers to a question in the second language, and I know I'm going to be the last person in the room that gets picked on, I have a lot of time to monitor. Whereas if I might be in the middle of a conversation with somebody, or I am visiting a country that uses my target language, I might be standing in line and there's a whole bunch of people behind me and I got to get going with what I want to say. I wouldn't have as much time to use the monitor. As for focused on correctness, we'll go over that in about a second. And knowing the rules, pretty simple. If you don't know the rules, you can't monitor yourself. It's kind of like that idea that as we get better in a topic, we tend to kind of we start to underestimate our abilities. We start questioning ourselves a little bit more. The more rules you know, the more you're focused on being correct. And there's also ideas of things like, say, a baby, when they're learning like their first language, they don't really care about correctness. They care about communicating. They don't really go through all these rules in their head. Whereas like somebody like an adult who's trying to pick up a second language, they are constantly asking these questions. So let's go over these ones. So Krashen says essentially that in order to most effectively use the monitor, there needs to be kind of a happy medium. You cannot overuse the monitor and you cannot underuse the monitor. He says that there are two problems that kind of show up based off of whether or not you're overusing or underusing. For somebody who overuses, this quote right here from Krashen himself, these are people who attempt to monitor all the time. Performers who are constantly checking their output with their conscious knowledge of the second language. As a result, such performers may speak hesitantly, often self-correct in the middle of utterances, and are so concerned with their correctness that they cannot speak with any real fluency. Essentially this idea that you're spending so much time doubting yourself and your ability to speak in the target language that it ends up just, your knowledge is too much, you're asking too many questions, it's really making it very difficult for you to talk at all, despite the fact that you have so much knowledge in this language that you know to correct yourself as often as you are. And then he also says that on the other end, there would be monitor underusers. These are performers who have not learned, or if they have learned, prefer not to use their conscious knowledge, even when conditions allow it. Underusers are typically uninfluenced by error correction, can self-correct only by using a feel for correctness, and rely completely on the acquired system. This will allow you to speak confidently, but if you are not familiar with the rules you're using, or if you are kind of speaking too quickly or speaking overconfidently, this can result in the things like using the incorrect tense, using a word incorrectly, using the wrong tone if it's like a tonal language, those kind of things. It takes me to the story of Kennedy at the Berlin Wall, where allegedly he accidentally said, like, instead of saying "I am of Berlin," he says like "I am a jelly donut," because he doesn't correct himself. He speaks too confidently off of a term that was just kind of written for him to say in a speech. As for critiques of this theory, the two big ones. One that comes up consistently throughout a lot of critics of his is that he over-relies on conscious correction. Many argue that this can hinder fluency and natural communication. It's not something you really can do organically. And the other thing is that a lot of this theory has not been tested. It's a common thing you're going to hear a lot of the time with any theory that is proposed in any field. Is there enough evidence to actually back this up? And it's kind of difficult to do so. As for an activity I kind of came up with to test out how we do this, how each person does this. I like to think about when you took your second language classes in school. For most Americans, this is going to be Spanish as their second language. I know at the school I teach, the only foreign language we offer is Spanish. So for most American students, this is going to be Spanish. Give an example sentence for the students to say in their second language, such as, "I learned Spanish in high school," or "Sorry, my Spanish isn't that good." And while they are trying to say that sentence, after they kind of get out what they finally needed to get out, or they say nothing because they're confused or they don't know why you're asking the question, ask the student to write down what their thought process was as they start to say the sentence without any materials. Of course, we're not going to ask them to use Google Translate or that kind of thing because, I mean, you shouldn't. That's the point of the activity. And then ask, like, for their thought process, what stopped them or what allowed them, like, what were they thinking about as they were trying to put this sentence together? And some thoughts you might look for. Things like, am I using the right verb tense? That was one thing when I took French in high school. It was really kind of difficult for me to get down. Is my sentence in order? Am I using the right words? Stuff like, do you know the vocabulary? And then like sentence order. Usually in Spanish, a lot of sentence order is very similar to English. However, things like adjectives, somebody who might overemphasize their corrections might get confused if they use the correct adjective noun order in their sentence. Whereas somebody who might underutilize it, in a lot of Latin languages, it is common for a lot of adjectives to go after the noun. And they might instead say the adjective before the noun instead, which could make a sentence that isn't correct. Is my pronunciation good? That's another one. A lot of people worry a ton about their pronunciation, whereas some people don't. Then there's other things, such as, I know the big one with Latin languages when you are an English learner is that English does not have gendered nouns. There's no el, la, or that kind of thing. It's all the in English. So there's things like people might overthink the gender or underthink it, resulting in a sentence that might not make too much sense, or does. What I'm going to leave you guys off with after this are my two questions. First off, and you can also see these at the bottom of the handout that I made, comprehension question for you guys. How does Monitor Hypothesis propose that learners use conscious knowledge in language production? And my feedback question about the theory for you guys is, what are your thoughts on the potential limitations of the Monitor Hypothesis in real-world language? Once again, you guys can leave your comments and replies down below. This has been Tom Gerard on Monitor Hypothesis by Stephen Krashen. And that is it for me. I look forward to reading you guys' responses to this video.